Avant toute chose, il nous faut remercier notre nombreuse audience d'avoir fait l'effort de venir écouter cette nouvelle conférence du professeur Willem Jongman. Je n'ai pas besoin de le représenter à nouveau parce que je pense que pour l'essentiel, vous étiez là la semaine dernière. Il suffit peut-être de répéter que cet homme m'a dianisé en m'ouvrant les yeux sur le fait que les archéologues ont le nez un peu trop dans la terre et ne voient pas le contexte très souvent dans lequel ils travaillent et ils ne voient pas tout ce qui a disparu puisqu'ils sont aveuglés par leur propre découverte. Aujourd'hui, après avoir traité de la question de la démographie, il va essayer de nous ouvrir les yeux sur le niveau de vie à l'époque romaine et comment est-ce qu'on peut l'approcher aujourd'hui à partir de l'archéologie.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Pierre. Last week, we observed that the Roman Empire was not at all a static society. In many parts of the empire, population was far larger than it had ever been before, and far larger than it would be for a long time to come. But we've also observed, let's remind you of the sort of the core graph of last week. We're tempted to think that this large population was a good thing, but doubts have been voiced because it also meant that more mouths had to be fed. Did everyone, or at least ordinary people, just get a smaller piece of the cake as a result? Or were there more cake eaters because the cake was larger? Before we look at the complex empirical data, we have to look at the economic theory that's involved. Because I think without that, it will be impossible to understand the issue properly. In its simplest form, the problem of population pressure and its consequences for standard of living is that the two factors of production, here, land and labor, is the problem of the two factors of production, land and labor. Ignoring capital for the moment, in an agricultural economy, land and labor are what's needed to produce crops. So with more land and more labor, more of the crop can be produced. However, with one of these two, there is a problem, i.e., the supply of land is quite inelastic. You can't easily make more of it. Even if and when that would be very desirable and lucrative. So the story of world population growth is also the story of a changing land-labor ratio. More and more people are having to work on the same land, and therefore the proportions between land and labor changed. Unfortunately, that change usually has some negative consequences. To put it in layman's terms, if you put twice as many farmers on the same plot of land, output will indeed increase, but it will not double. It will only grow by perhaps 50%. Theoretically, this is called declining marginal labor productivity, i.e. the extra contribution from one extra unit of labor is less than the extra contribution by the previous unit of labor. The speed by which marginal labor productivity declines is obviously crop dependent, and with some types of crops, the point at which it makes no sense to use more labor is reached faster than with others. We'll discuss this in the last lecture. However, the result is always unfortunate for the laborer. Labor is not paid because it needs or morally deserves to be paid, but because of, and only to the extent of, its productive contribution. And it's even worse than that. Labor is only paid the value of the marginal product, i.e. the productivity of the last unit. Therefore, in its simplest form, In a more or less competitive labour market, population pressure implies a declining marginal labour productivity and hence declining labour incomes. And that is not good news. Conversely, with more labour to work the land, marginal productivity of the land improves. And hence, you guessed it already, incomes of landowners. So, in its simplest theoretical form, a rapid population growth, such as we saw last week, implies a reduction of labour incomes and an increase in rents. The gap between rich and poor increases. For late antiquity, with its dramatic population decline, this basic analysis predicts the opposite. Rising labour incomes, many happy and prosperous peasants, and impoverished landowners. This, of course, is the simplest possible model. Rather than expand, like we saw, at the intensive margin, using more and more labour on the same land, farmers and landowners could sometimes also expand at the so-called extensive margin, even at sometimes considerable cost, by terracing hillsides, draining marshes, etc. Finally, of course, they could change their technologies by choosing different and by themselves more labour-intensive crops like horticulture. However, by and large, population pressure could be an unpleasant challenge, depressing labour incomes and making the rich richer. Those of you who've read my Pompeii book will remember that that was my scenario for that town and its very populated countryside. The question, of course, is it also true? That's what this lecture is about. Did the steady rise of population in Republican Italy and later also in the many provinces indeed depress labour incomes and popular standard of living? And conversely, did late antique population decline inaugurate a period of improving standard of living? The simplest way to look at this is to see if and by how much people could live above the bare minimum for subsistence. Now, I appreciate that in the modern world, any definition of poverty line is highly contentious. Do people really need to have a television and all these things, or is that not part of the poverty? Is that well above the poverty line? It's a social construct, modern poverty. But I think it's useful to define the cost of bare subsistence at the very, very minimum. It provides us with a yardstick to compare real incomes with. How much above bare subsistence did people live? That's important, because several existing estimates put real incomes of the mass of the population at only about 1.5 times subsistence, particularly Keith Hopkins' famous analysis. And that's obviously a pretty grim scenario. So, how many calories does one need to just survive? Well, we don't do an experiment, but it depends on age and sex and on the type of work you do. These are estimates by a former student of mine, Bouke van Latem. Looking at the numbers, it's obvious that the real age distribution is important to calculate an average. We talked about age distributions last week. From what we learned last week, we have a rough idea, however. If we use that, with lots of children, we arrive at a daily average of about 2,000 calories, more for men and less for women, of course. And also, of course, a little for the cost of clothing and shelter. If you add that, the bare minimum equates to about 250 kilograms of wheat, or its calorific equivalent in other cereals. Here I use cereals for the example, because they offered the cheapest calories, and we're looking at the bare minimum after all. Next, we should try to convert this into monetary prices. We have a few prices for wheat, typically about 2 to 4 sesterces per modius of about 6.5 kilograms. So if we use 3 sesterces for a modius, the annual cost of 250 kilograms of wheat would be 115 sesterces. That's real Roman money. Of course, this is only a very rough estimate, but it does indicate the right order of magnitude. Compare, for example, these 115 sesterces with the 100,000 sesterces per annum that Cicero claimed as the bare minimum. I think it tells you something about Cicero and his lifestyle, and it tells you something about the use of literary sources. What can you do with them and what can't you do with them? Compare it also to the perhaps 1.2 million sesterces annual income of Pliny the Younger, a century and a half later. That was 10,000 times our subsistence minimum. And by all accounts, Pliny was only a middling senator. For much of his life, he worked hard to give away his money, but he largely failed. There was just too much of it. The same 115 sesterces for the subsistence minimum can also be used to estimate the real magnitude of some public expenditure. It's a nice yardstick. Janet Delaney, for example, has ingeniously calculated the construction cost of the bath of Caracalla at Rome at about 60 million sesterces. This equates to 500,000 times the minimum subsistence for a year. Again, it gives you nice orders of magnitude. But of course, the 115 sesterces can also serve to estimate how much real wages exceeded the bare subsistence minimum. And that's what we're going to do first. We're going to have a look at the surviving wage data, even though they're relatively few and problematic. And in the second half of the lecture, I will then look at consumption patterns to see what people could do and not do with that money. Now, we have some wages for ordinary people in the early empire, and for adult-free males, they seem to be in the range of 500 to 1,000 sesterces per annum. The base pay for a legionary soldier in the Augustan age was 900 sesterces, and typical pay was about 1,200 to 2,000. But on the other hand, to give you again some idea, soldiers in the Roman world, unlike in the early modern world, Roman soldiers were relatively well off, relatively well paid. Now, these wages all seem to be well above subsistence and could support a family in some comfort, particularly if there was also some other income from a working wife or a working older child. At the lower end, and probably for single persons, we have documented values from legal sources for subsistence annuities to support foster children or a freedman. Their average value was 480 sesterces. So it's a couple of times subsistence minimum. And this is probably for sort of single persons who didn't need to support others. Koenraad Verboven has recently studied once again, the Pompeian graffito with the expenses for 8 days of a family of 2 adults and a slave, and averaging 7 sesterces a day, but excluding clothing and rent. Even though that family spent about 75% on food, some of this food was rather nice, not really subsistence minimum food. His conclusion was that granted the higher prices in central Italy than elsewhere, this family spent 4 to 5 times the cost of subsistence. So again, sort of somewhat above the minimum. Now, the limitation of these wages and prices is that most of them are from the early imperial period, and do not allow an analysis of changes over time. And you remember from last time, I was really interested in change. And these figures are sort of bits and pieces here and there, and that's it. Additionally, there were clear regional differences in prices. We know prices in Italy were higher than in the provinces, and the lower, the further away from Rome you go, basically. So we want something better. Now, the next type of data that I want to look into is a rather different sort of data, slave prices. As Jussi Tuinmaa already argued in 1970, he's an economist, was an economist, a famous one, the price of a slave represents what is called the net present value of the difference between subsistence and the market wage for free labor. I'll explain. It represents the capitalized value of the stream of future income that the slave will be deprived of, corrected for financing and depreciation charges. A slave costs money to buy precisely because wage labor costs more than subsistence. If wages were as low as subsistence, there was no point in buying a slave because you would also have to feed the slave, so why buy? So the extent to the price of a slave is a measure of the extent to which the alternative wage labor exceeded the minimum. To judge from the hundreds of manumission inscriptions from Delphi, the price of full freedom for an adult male slave rose from about 3,500 kilograms of wheat equivalent in the first half of the 2nd century BC to about 7,000 kilogram wheat equivalent in the last half of the 1st century BC. Slaves were expensive and getting more expensive, precisely because wages were well above subsistence, and increasingly so. These numbers suggest that, taking financing and depreciation charges into account, typical adult male wages rose to about 700 kilograms of wheat equivalent per annum above subsistence, for a total of about 4 times subsistence. Now, this also converges with typical slave prices of 1,000 to a few thousand sesterces in Italy under the early Principate. So, same ballpark, but bad data. In short, the implied relevant wage is something like 500 sesterces. In the case of the slave prices and the implied wage, this was, of course, only for the male slave himself. In this case, that we don't have to cater for the family, because the wife would also need to be paid, would have to be bought separately, and the cost of the children is either already to some extent integrated in the depreciation charge, and also, of course, young slaves also cost money. So here we are really talking about implied disposable incomes of about 4 times subsistence. That's higher than the other figures that we've just mentioned. But on the other hand, these were almost certainly mostly urban slaves and well-trained and educated, and probably therefore expensive. Slaves are not at the bottom of the ladder of occupations by and large, and certainly not the kinds of slaves who were being manumitted. Slaves in the mines wouldn't be manumitted. Different data are available from Rome and Egypt, and these have very recently been studied again by Kyle Harper in the recent issue of the Journal of Economic History. This is undoubtedly the best data set we have for wages and prices. And even if there are question marks, because for some periods we do not really have enough data, I also think we can draw some important conclusions, both with regard to absolute levels and with regard to changes over time. without going into great and technical detail, let me present some of the most important findings of this remarkable study. Since there were various monetary changes over this long period, I will only show what we may call real wages, i.e. monetary wages expressed in terms of the quantity of wheat that they could buy at that particular moment in time. These are for unskilled work, so they represent some bottom line. The three vertical dashed lines represent the three big epidemics of later antiquity, the Antonine, the Cyprianic, and the Justinianic plague. The Antonine plague, oh, this is not very clear, I'm afraid, sorry. Because they figure prominently in the explanations for economic change. And Kyle Harper is also very interested in plagues of various kinds. He's really recently published a very good article on the Cyprianic plague in the Journal of Roman Archaeology. As you can see, the biggest impact of the Antonine plague in particular is that they inaugurated a period of far less documentation. The decline in the volume of administrative documentation is also visible in other records from Egypt. And as Richard Duncan Jones already remarked 20 years ago, it represents the disintegration of administrative systems. The scale here is annualized wages. Some of the wages are day wages, others are monthly, and others are annual wages, and they're all annualized wages in hectolitres of wheat. So how much were they paid? The wages range from about 10 hectolitres, say 750 to 800 kilograms, to about 20 hectolitres, 1,500 to 1,600 kilograms per annum, with a clearly rising trend. This really goes up. Until the Antonine plague, these wages had become increasingly generous, rising from about 3 times subsistence and therefore just about enough to support a family at the beginning of the period to a maximum of some 6 times subsistence, but with more variation just before the Antonine plague. Highest prosperity was clearly achieved in the period before that Antonine plague. In fact, this was, of course, the period that Edward Gibbon once called the happiest for the human race. Well, some of our predecessors, I think, had a perceptive eye. Therefore, things clearly take a turn for the worse. Thereafter, things clearly take a turn for the worse, indicated by the downward sloping line for the entire period, which is what he reconstructed here. A downward sloping trend line. However, in reality, there are, of course, 2 trends. An upwards one for the first period and a downward one for the second one, or perhaps a more or less flat trend at a much lower level. Now, I've only just got hold of this stuff, so as soon as I get home, I'll start to do some more serious regression analysis. But I think this is roughly it for these data. And I think they're important, and I think they show a recognizable story. The last set of wage and price data comes from the edict on maximum prices issued by the Emperor Diocletian in AD 301. Admittedly, the absolute numbers are of course problematic because these are below market maximum prices. But one can argue that their relative value is likely to have been more or less realistic as long as civil servants knew what they were doing. That at least was the reasonable assumption of Bob Allen, the modern economic historian from Oxford, who recently looked at them and put them in the same comparative framework he had used for other pre-modern societies. The method is simple, and it's also used for the calculation of the modern price index that you are obviously very interested in the modern world. He reconstructed two notional baskets of consumer goods, like you do in the modern world. One bare bones in his case, and the other a bit more comfortable and generous. The respectability basket, as he calls it. He then compared these to the wages of various types of labourers to see how close these were to the bare bones basket and to the cost of the more comfortable respectability basket. Finally, he compared these results with the estimates he had calculated for a range of other pre-modern societies. The metric here is what he calls the welfare ratio. How much can a family of 3 adults live above the very minimum of the bare bones basket? Now, a couple of things you can see here. This is Rome. This is reconstruction for Rome. It's not very cheerful. It's a bit above the minimum, but not that much. It's better than much of Europe in the 18th century, as you can also see. The only exceptions being the Netherlands. You can see the people in Amsterdam ordinary people in Amsterdam were a few times more prosperous than anyone else in Europe. Or the Brits, who were at some stage even overtaking us in Holland. Here they go. But these are the two nations in Europe that really are on a different pattern already from the later Middle Ages onward. The entire early modern period, the Netherlands and England are far more prosperous than anybody else. You can also see, interestingly, that apart from the Dutch and the English, everybody else was getting poorer all the time. From just after the Black Death, when things were suddenly getting better, of course, because there was suddenly competition in the labour markets, because labour had become scarce. But after that, it's a slope down to the bottom until finally, sort of in the mid-19th century, the benefits of the Industrial Revolution were beginning to reach lower strata of society. This is the long story of European economic history. So, Rome is better than the worst that you could have, but not that much better. Okay, yes, people in Amsterdam were more prosperous than anybody else. And by the time of Diocletian, Roman workers really had, I think, a pretty grim time. They were surviving. I mean, these people were not anymore. They were below subsistence, so they had to adapt to the market by reduction of their body weight. These at least were above subsistence, but not much anymore. So let me summarize what we've so far. In terms of trends, we have a fairly consistent pattern. During the Republican period, the Delphi manumission records suggest rising wages for free labour to levels well above subsistence for a single adult male, which is what those numbers represent. But probably many of these slaves had been skilled urban workers, illustrating the premium for skilled labour. The rise in the number of slaves, precisely in the period that they were getting more expensive, similarly suggests labour was getting more and more expensive. For the early imperial period, the various numbers that we have, principally from Egypt, suggest a continuing rise in real wages to levels that for all but the poorest workers could be quite a bit above subsistence for the family. Here, a working wife and a working child could make a real difference to family income. Finally, both the Egyptian data and Diocletian's price edict suggest that from perhaps the Antonine period, real incomes for unskilled labour started to decline and ended up at little more than subsistence for a family. However, we should not forget that the data remain very tenuous. This is really very, very bad stuff. What we have seems to make sense, but we don't have that much. There is also another thing that should be mentioned, and that these data are primarily, apart from perhaps the slave prices, are primarily for unskilled labour. Characteristic, of course, precisely for the late Republican and early imperial period, is the growth of social group of people above that. These are not in any of these figures. So even if unskilled labour only goes up and down a little bit, there is this enormous growth of a group of skilled workers, well, hard to say, shall we call them middle class, but there's all the cities of the empire, you see the growth of a middling group of people who are quite comfortable and well off. And that group didn't exist in the early period, and it ceases to exist, of course, in the late empire. So that's perhaps more important than the changes in these wages, but it's even harder to guess and to estimate. So that was the first half of the story. It's now time to turn to spending patterns. What could people do? The beauty of expenditure is that quite a bit of it leaves traces, and archaeological traces in particular, much better data. Analytically, the core economic concept is that of income elasticity of demand. How sensitive is the demand for a particular good for income? How sensitive is it for income change? If you get a pay rise, you may not eat more bread or potatoes, but you may eat more oysters. In this example, bread and potatoes have a low income elasticity and oysters a high income elasticity. So if we want to see to what extent people had higher incomes, we have to look for and zoom in on their expenditure on high income elasticity goods. That's where their prosperity will be betrayed. But before we do that, we must first pay some attention to the real low income elasticity goods, such as subsistence food. After all, security at the most basic level matters and is potentially precarious given the risk of bad harvests. If that's not secured, then the rest of the story is obviously pretty irrelevant. It's great if you are rich on average, but if you die of famine once every 10 years, it's not a good deal. So let's first have a look at sort of basic subsistence. Because we know from time to time harvest failed. At the same time, it is also clear that urban magistrates did their best to alleviate the problems, so that in the end, in the judgment of Peter Garnsey, catastrophic famines were largely avoided. Here, of course, we should mention the grain supply of the city of Rome. After earlier beginnings, a system of distribution of 400 kilograms of wheat per annum to some 200,000 adult male citizens in the city of Rome was developed, supplied largely from grain received as taxes in provinces such as Egypt. The ration of 400 kilograms was generous and obviously enough for almost 2 adults if they almost only consumed wheat and not more elegant food. In practice, for a family, the very poor would have supplemented this with the purchase of the cheapest calories available, i.e. more wheat. For anyone with a bit more money, the supplement would have consisted of nicer food, such as vegetables, olive oil, some meat, and of course wine. Let's not forget that wine contains many calories, especially the sweet white wine that the Romans preferred. So if you drink enough wine, you don't need to eat much else. So the distributions provided a basic provision for almost all free inhabitants of the city. Receiving it was a ritual of political inclusion. Once every month, you would report on the designated day at the designated window at the Porticus Minucius to receive your 33 kilograms. Hence, just imagine, each day some 7,000 citizens could be seen in the city of Rome, walking home, lugging home their free grain. Very, very powerful image of what it was like to be a Roman citizen. This is great, you can see it every day. Now, in addition, there was of course not just the benefit of receiving calories for free, but the bread wheat that you received, and preferably quite white, because if it wasn't, the population started to complain. Bread wheat was already a luxury compared to the pulse, the porridge, that the Romans had eaten until sometime in the 2nd century BC. It was only after they'd secured Sicily that they could start eating the bread wheat that was a bit more risky in terms of famine, crop failure. But they could leave the Sicilians with the risk of a failed crop. So in the 2nd century BC, you see this changeover. So bread in circuses, bread's already better than just pulse. And because the wheat was free, they could use their money to buy better and nicer food as a supplement. And that's indeed how my story continues. Not only in the city of Rome, where actually other food was later on added as well, but also elsewhere. Everywhere we can witness a shift to more expensive but nicer and sometimes also healthier food with a higher income elasticity. Bacchus and Jacomet noted that the Roman conquest of northwestern Europe was followed by the introduction of a wave of new fruits and vegetables, some now locally produced and some, like figs, important. We even have rice from India. My student Frits Heinrich has used the digital archive of archaeological plant remains in the Netherlands to study this in greater detail. Before the advent of the Romans, diet was really grim. I know you think that the Dutch eat badly. Well, it was a lot worse at that time. Things rapidly improved under Roman rule, with a range of new fruits and vegetables to make life healthier and more pleasant. When the Romans abandoned the Netherlands, pretty early on actually, the diet began to deteriorate again. And after that you have to wait until sort of the 17th century, when the Dutch were more prosperous, and the gluttony of the 17th century, to see such rich food on Dutch tables once again. My student Douwe Visser has done something similar for Roman Britain. His comparable results, even if those data are not as well brought together as for the Netherlands. And this, of course, reminds us once again of the need for good scientific archaeology and of the need to aggregate those data into comprehensive and accessible data sets. This also reminds us of the importance of archaeobotany. My colleague René Kappers has found considerable quantities of Indian pepper in a Roman port along the Red Sea. And Pliny the Elder complains in the 1st century AD of the demand for pepper. However, he also tells us the price in Italy: 28 sesterces per pound for white pepper and just 14 sesterces per pound for black pepper. Given that you really don't need that much, these are remarkably low prices. Also testimony, I think, to the size of the Roman sea trade with India. Horticulture was an integral part of Roman agriculture at the height of the empire's power. Fruits are abundantly portrayed on Pompeian wall paintings as a reminder of the good life. And they were produced in what seems large quantities. Moreover, they were not only nice, but they were also a very intensive type of agriculture, producing large quantities of calories per hectare, but using a lot of manpower. This is what you need under population pressure. Two other crops have to be mentioned here, but will be discussed again in the last lecture. The first is olives and olive oil. Both made up for some of the dietary deficiencies of a cereals-based diet and were rich in calories. Olive oil had the additional advantage that it could be used for other purposes as well, such as cleaning the skin or as lamp oil. But it could also be transported quite easily. Spain and North Africa became important export regions, supplying Rome and Italy, but also, of course, Northwestern Europe. Proper civilized life is impossible without olive oil. A veritable trade in this food emerged, connecting far apart regions of the empire into an integrated culinary regime and a similar lifestyle. Of course, the same applied to wine. Both in Italy and elsewhere, wine became not only a part of the Roman cultural identity, but also of the diet of rich and poor alike, even if they did not all drink the same quality of wine. It's estimated that on average Romans drank some 100 liters of wine a year. Since women and children drank far less, this amounts to perhaps the equivalent of a modern bottle of wine a day for adult males. Now, that's a serious but not impossible quantity, and comparable to early modern consumption figures for the Mediterranean. In terms of calories, 100 liters a year of sweet white wine represented about a quarter of caloric intake, reminding us again that simplifying diet to just cereals is far too simplistic. Wine made a real contribution. But oil, wine, fruits and vegetables were not all. Romans also began to eat more meat. Historically, meat consumption is a favorite indicator of prosperity and a clear example of a high-income elasticity good. Of course, meat cannot be excavated directly, but animal bones can be. This is what you have in this graph. Animal bone assemblages from the dataset put together by Tony King. This one for Italy. The pattern is quite clear and more or less identical for pigs, sheep, goats and oxen, cows. They all go up and down in quite similar fashion. The decline in the 3rd century AD is clear, just as a late antique recovery. And after the 5th century, of course, clearly the light goes out. They have to become vegetarians again, sadly. When we look at provincial data, a similar pattern may be observed, even if the rise in meat consumption started later. Sorry, I couldn't find the graph with the separate for the separate kinds of animals, but it doesn't really matter. The rise in meat consumption in the provinces is obviously later and has to wait until the arrival of the Romans. Just think of Monty Python Life of Brian. What did the Romans ever do for us? Well, this. Better diet. So Roman history in the provinces is quite simply shorter than it is in Italy, which is not a surprise. These data are heavily biased towards Northwestern Europe, I'm afraid. All this kind of stuff depends on the quality of the archaeology and the quality of the archaeological service. So this is not a story about the Roman East, I'm afraid. What I should add to these graphs is that during the heydays of these graphs, Roman livestock was also significantly bigger than before or after, as Geoffrey Crone, Durand and Levaux have demonstrated, perhaps doubling meat weight per animal. Every type of Roman animal in the in the late Republican and early imperial period is significantly bigger, whether it's pigs, cows, sheep, goats, Roman chicken are far bigger than before and after. So in terms of meat rather than numbers of bones, like in those graphs, my graphs are still a serious underestimate. The same, in fact, also applied to Roman chicken. And Mark Maltby and his team in Britain have recently shown that there were suddenly eaten in far more of them in Roman Britain. So it's a similar story. Fish too was probably eaten in rather larger quantities, and as garum it was even traded long distance. This is not quantities of the product, but installed capacity of the production sites from a project by Andrew Wilson. Again, this is high-value food that's circulated in a large market. Even in this case, it's hard to estimate how far down the social ladder it reached. But we have enough garum amphorae to say that it was not just a delicacy for a tiny elite. Ideally, one would like to reconstruct the consumption patterns of individual Romans of different social classes. One way is to do this is stable isotope analysis of skeletal material, because you are what you've eaten, to see if fish and meat were indeed consumed more. Unfortunately, that's a route fraught with difficulties, but a lot is being done right now, and I expect to see clear results over the next few years. Then we will really know much better what they actually ate. Another way is exemplified by a recent paper by Erika Rowan on the content of the large sewer at Herculaneum in an edited volume on Pompeii to be published next month. It shows an extraordinarily rich and varied diet with a lot of seafood, and not just for the rich. And there you can actually connect the stuff in the sewer to the house right above it. It's a fascinating article. A similar picture can be drawn for household goods. Roman houses were full of sometimes rather nice tableware, quality cookery pots, iron kitchen knives, and what have you. The contrast with earlier and later times is striking. The houses themselves were often also rather nicer, with more space, tiled roofs, increasingly functionally separate rooms for people and animals, metal fixtures like locks and intricate keys, or window glass, an example of which this piece of window glass comes from a small Roman settlement in the Netherlands and not from a wealthy villa. It is sort of a big farmhouse, nothing special, in an out-of-the-way region. A few hundred years later, the descendants of these people would be living in huts again. The Roman zest for building is quite apparent in the chronology of wood consumption for building. This is from Germany. This is a graph of dated Roman wood from Western Germany, and it's argued that much of this was used for building. Now, the beauty of wood is, of course, that with the recent advances in the study of tree rings, it can now often be dated to the year, giving a chronological precision that is rare in archaeology. Interestingly here, of course, and perhaps something to remember, is that the upswing already started before the Roman conquest. The downturn is also very obvious. Now, window glass, to come back to the window glass, allowed more natural light into the house while keeping the cold out, not unimportant in the northern regions, of course. The Roman period also witnessed a surge in artificial lighting, however, both to extend the working day and to make life more comfortable. You all know Roman oil lamps, and urban excavations are full of them, just like brass chandeliers, such as known from Pompeii. Burning olive oil was not cheap, so other fuels were used as well, perhaps particularly in the countryside, where oil lamps are rare outside a villa context. The zeal for comfort and refinement also extended to personal care. Roman excavations are full of combs, makeup items, or personal jewelry, even if in its cheapest form. Romans of the period also used far more perfume, as Jean-Pierre Brun has been so imaginatively documenting. Unfortunately, there's one big problem with the examples I've given thus far. Many have to remain anecdotal until someone collects all known instances, instead of the cherry picking that I've been doing. Such larger data sets will hopefully confirm my suggestions, but maybe not. And it's only with such larger data sets that we can begin to probe the driving forces. The second problem is that many of even the largest sets are just aggregate totals and do not take population change into account. Take, for example, the graph on meat consumption. Was it not simply the case that meat consumption increased because there were more people eating meat? Even if that's so, it's of course reassuring that they were not eating less because of population pressure. Ideally, we should of course deflate such graphs for changes in population. And that's precisely what I've done in the next graph. This is principally an exercise in methodology. The basis for this graph is once again the data set of the Nettuno survey project in the Pontine region, south of Rome, that was executed by my colleagues Timon de Haas, Gijs Tol and Peter Attema. You will remember I showed you their population estimates last week. This time I'm using that same population curve here in light grey at the top to deflate the curves for fine tableware and amphory shirts that they found. So what I did was I divided the number of tableware and amphory shirts by the population estimate for each period to arrive at per capita time series for tableware and amphory shirts. And that is what you have. The dark grey is the amphory shirts and the red is the tableware shirts. The results are a bit messy because the time periods do not coincide neatly, but the general picture is very clear. I think we really need to sort of clean up the shape of the graphs a bit, but I think the biggest message is that population pressure did not depress standard of living in a Malthusian fashion. On the contrary, the period of largest population also witnessed the highest consumption of fine tableware and amphory. The graph also shows the danger of archaeological invisibility. The amphora curve declines rather early and clearly earlier than either population or tableware. This probably doesn't imply that Romans had become teetotalers, but only that they, as André Chernia has shown so clearly, largely went over to archaeologically invisible containers like skins and wooden barrels. But for all its weaknesses, the graph shows a pattern and suggests a useful methodology to be replicated with other data sets, if only to make sure that this result is not a fluke. The skeptic could of course argue that much of what I've shown you is quite simply only proof of the wealth of the Roman elite. And admittedly, the Roman elite were indeed wealthy. The question is if they left anything for a sub-elite, or even for men, even for many more average Romans. Archaeologically, this means that the challenge is to decide how far down the social ladder all these comforts reached. That's not always quite so easy, and it obviously does not interest many archaeologists. Large numbers of villas have been excavated, but only very few farmhouses. Nevertheless, it's my honest impression that consumer society reached much further down the social scale than it did before or would do for a long time after. And in the end, with better archaeology, it's a question that we could answer much better than we can now. Recently, some modern economists have looked at this as well. Milanovic, Lindet and Williamson are three respected specialists of the comparative analysis of social inequality. Their key concept is what they call the extraction ratio, i.e. the ratio between what the elite managed to extract for itself and what they could have extracted if they've left nothing but subsistence for anyone else. A really grim version. Using panel data based on estimates by Scheidel, Fries and myself for the size and wealth of the elite and for population and GDP, they concluded that Roman social inequality was relatively moderate, perhaps a counterintuitive finding, compared to many other historical societies. Some were more equal, but others were less equal. This is the worst possible. That's the inequality frontier, as they call, and Rome, this is Byzantium, and Rome is here. So it could be rather worse, could also be better. You can see the most advanced societies like England and Holland have far greater equality. Two things may be added, however. If you substitute either a larger population than their low count estimate or a more prosperous one, as I would do, then the relatively pessimistic, more optimistic estimate for incomes, there would have been far more wealth that could have been extracted but was not. So even with these pessimistic estimates, Roman inequality was in the middle of the range. If we use more optimistic, and I think in my view more realistic estimates, inequality was even lower. That is important if we want to understand Rome's success. At its height, it was what Acemoglu and Robertson have called an inclusive society, where citizenship mattered. Conversely, if we insert more pessimistic estimates typical of late antiquity, the extraction ratio becomes far less inclusive. By then, Rome had become what Acemoglu and Robertson called an extractive society, where the elite left little for anyone else. Finally, I want to present to you an altogether different set of data on what is commonly called the biological standard of living, or to say it in common language, body length. The project's database and initial analysis was compiled by a brilliant graduate student, Geertje Klein-Goldwijk, and is now completed by Jan Jacobs, an econometrician with an interest in standard of living, and by myself. But this is work in progress. It's been well known for quite a while that if people are healthier, they will grow taller. So, for example, I'm 1.77 m, and it is precisely the average of Dutch males of my generation. Since then, the average has crept up to about 1.82 m, which is exactly the length of my 18-year-old son. We've seen this process wherever there has been economic growth and improvements in health. Hence, historians like Emmanuel Laroy-Ladurie, Richard Steckel, John Komlos, Jörg Baten and Robert Vogel have used medical records from military service, from orphanages, etc., to reconstruct changes in human body length over time. You may wonder how this could be that people change so much in body length. Isn't body length a genetic thing? At an individual level, this is certainly true. Tall parents tend to have tall children. At population level, the story is different, however. Take, for example, the region where I live in the Netherlands. 150 years ago, this was a very poor region, and the inhabitants were among the shortest people in the world. And now, their descendants are among the tallest. But the Dutch, therefore, have not always been tall. So why are people tall, or perhaps better formulated, why are some people short? The answer is that staying short is a protective response of the body. The body is a very carefully balanced system to produce an optimum output from an input of food and under varying conditions. So each and every time the balance is disturbed because the body receives less food, or when the body has to work harder to cope with cold weather, hard work, nurturing a child, or fighting infectious disease, the body resets its priorities. So if the net result of the balance between food and demands on the body deteriorates, the body resets its priorities, and growing tall is actually not that important. So in the past, people were shorter because they were not as well fed as we are, particularly not as well fed with animal protein, and they were not as well protected against infectious disease. So their growth was stunted. Incidentally, this applies more to men than to women because women's bodies are more resilient and therefore less useful for this analysis. Altogether, changes in body length have been a powerful indicator of changes in health over long time periods, but also of differences between regions and between social classes. As you will appreciate, if we want to study this for earlier periods, we do not have documentary records, so instead we have to use skeletal material. This, however, is easier said than done. The first problem is that not all bones survive equally well. Male skeletons survive better because the bones are more robust. And of those, the femur, the thigh bone, is more robust than other long bones. Therefore, for many skeletons, we only have a few bones, most often the femur. So how do we restore a femur to a whole body? Anthropologists have a number of formulae to extrapolate from single bones to full skeletons, but these produce rather divergent results. After careful analysis, we concluded that none of these formulae were any good, and that we did better to work with the individual long bones and their changes in length over time. We now have a database of about 42,000 bones, representing a bit over 10,000 individuals from about 500 BC to about AD 750, and from all parts of the empire. 10,000 sounds like a lot, but by the time you divide them over 50-year periods and between 4 regions, you will appreciate that many cells in the matrix are still quite sparingly populated. This is all the more so since there is a heavy geographical bias in the data. Western and particularly Northwestern Europe is heavily overrepresented. This, of course, almost, yes, that's the result. This overrepresentation of Northwestern Europe reflects the quality of the archaeological work and of the archaeological services. It's still quite common for human bones not to be studied properly, let alone to be published properly. A site average, which you sometimes get, is also pretty useless, and even more so if this is represented as a reconstructed total body length, where they really didn't have complete bodies. So we have plenty of difficulty, and we have overcome many, partly by being strict about the quality of the data. The final metric here is not in millimeters or centimeters or whatever, but factor scores that integrate the various bones into one number. It's a complex mathematical trick. The interpretation of this graph, however, is not so easy. You can see it goes down, 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 and people are shortest and at the period of greatest prosperity, and in late antiquity they get taller again. But it's hard to interpret, because underneath, for example, are obvious regional differences, but also changes in mortuary practices. In some periods, cremation was the norm, but not an equal measure for all social classes. So we still have a lot of analysis to do. Nevertheless, I wanted to give you a look into the kitchen. For now, I think the best interpretation that I can come up with is that we are witnessing a deterioration of people's health during the high times of the empire and a subsequent recovery. You will remember that last week I argued that there is good reason to believe that mortality did not decline during the last 2 centuries BC and the first 2 centuries AD. Today, I've argued that these centuries of much higher population also enjoyed a higher level of material welfare and also better food. And yet, the skeletal material suggests that this was accompanied by deteriorating health. Question is, how could this be? Remember that body length responds to 2 things in particular: diet and disease environment. I'm convinced the diet did not deteriorate. On the contrary, they were eating more meat. But how about disease environment and infectious diseases in particular? It's well known that these are often a function of population density and frequency of human interaction. In that respect, cities are the prime suspects. We know from comparative research that pre-industrial cities were death traps, with a mortality that exceeded natality by a pretty wide margin. Cities are the cradles of civilized life and economic growth. At the same time, they're places of death. I think Romans paid a price for their urbanized lifestyle and the high level of connectivity between those cities. As Angus Deaton, the economist, has reminded us, there is more to welfare than just per capita incomes and material welfare. Come back next week to hear about the urban economy and connectivity. Thank you.